From reaching trail to the Great March, from the aging ocean to the endless sea, from Fisherman's Row to Godcroft's.
This is
live
Everett
from
Way with
Studio
the
A in
Ladies and gentlemen,
PressCorps World
we have an
Headquarters.
emergent
This
announcement
is
concerning
Foxhole
the local
bringing you
conflict.
the latest news from
Ceasefire
across
between the two
Sea
warring
Valley
world
Wars.
powers has been halted, and an agreed-upon time of its official dissolution is less than an hour away, after which the 71st conflict of the Valley Masayan War will begin. Battle lines have been drawn along the River Mersey, and by any indication, this conflict is due to be possibly one of the most bloodiest in this series of conflicts. With many new factors entering this war, both parties are preparing for the onslaught ahead. They have enlisted help from their most fully rested regiments, their meritorious mercenaries, and their most dormant of divisions for this upcoming conflict, so impactful both sides deem it in the ongoing war. Along with new soldiers comes reports of new equipment fresh from the forges for each faction. New equipment to answer for the mighty armor columns that have plagued both sides, as well as new designs for small arms weapons going into circulation. Rumors of redesigned artillery with even greater ranges and more powerful warheads. And if that wasn't enough, we've even heard reports of the first severe blizzard confirmed as far south as the Foundry in Umbral Wildwood. That storm has now subsided. It's anyone's guess when and where the next one will hit. Ladies and gentlemen, listeners of all persuasions, if you have listened to our program in the past, you know that what we cover is chaos in the shape of conflict. Though none have been so varied nor unpredictable as what we may be about to witness here in the following weeks. Again, this is Everett Way with the PressCorps, joined in studio here with Geoffrey Jennings to cover this 71st conflict. Geoffrey, how are you doing this morning?
Doing okay, but we'll see just how long we're going to stay awake in order to keep coverage of this going, because all around the halls of power in both Valley and Siva and Masaya and all over the world, eyes are once again on the border territories that have not stopped fighting for many years. But this one in particular appears to be, this 71st conflict appears to be something that has been boiling over for some times. As you mentioned, we're seeing new levels of organization, new levels of inclement environmental hazards, and new weapons of war, although that has always been a consistent thing throughout these various battles. So how exactly that will play out is, quite frankly, anyone's guess. But I think you wanted to touch upon some certain new aspects that both of us had mentioned. I don't know where you wanted to start off with that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the... we'll start off on that new equipment that you were mentioning earlier. One of the things that this war and all factions within this war have been exceedingly good at is finding new ways to fight that war with new equipment, and there is no shortage of that with this new conflict coming up. There's advancement in almost every factor of warfare, whether it is armored, mechanized infantry warfare, whether it is anti-armor warfare, artillery, small arms. All of that has been either redesigned or made completely new for this conflict. It does seem like all factions are throwing their all into this.
Absolutely. And, seeing more specific models from both sides is something we have noticed in the lead up to this conflict. We know the Colonials will have a new kind of battle rifle at the helm. We know that the Wardens will have plenty of new sidearms, or actually one specific sidearm, as with the Colonials too. So really the expansive kind of arms race in terms of handheld firearms is going to be quite something to see. I think the biggest thing that we'll notice in terms of how this will affect troop movements, possibly and hopefully even squad movements, is new infantry support weapons that will involve kind of construction and tripods and all new things that we've noticed in the build-up to the war, and just in terms of how that will affect the movement of troops and their positioning, and how vehicles will respond to these new heavy weapons.
Absolutely. In the past, the war vehicles or tanks, armored cars, half-tracks, etc. I'll just consider them all war vehicles for just a moment. Their primary concern has, in the past, been other war vehicles, other combat vehicles. And I think that perspective is going to change. The question is, are they going to be ready for it? We've seen new anti-tank options for infantry. Some of them, I've heard that the Colonials have some form of handheld disposable rocket of sorts. The code name that I heard was the Ignifist. A bit of an imposing name, but I don't know if that's what the soldiers will call it. It is their answer to what used to be a short-range anti-tank grenade of sorts. This is a self-propelled grenade. The interesting thing for me is that it's disposable. That maybe I'm just a reporter, not a soldier, but that seems a little counterintuitive for me. However, I've heard it's really effective as an anti-tank option.
Ignifist. I actually just quite like that name alone, but we have yet to see if people will begin to call it, will really hone in on the fist, or if they're just going to say ignoramus, because it's a unique weapon that it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And correct me if I'm wrong. This isn't the one, or is this the one that fires in an arc pattern?
No, it's a self-propelled. It's a self-propelled rocket or grenade. I'm actually not specifically sure about that.
Rocket-propelled grenade, and it's a
straight fire, direct fire.
Yeah, that's what I thought, and it's usually stuff like that is usually much easier to handle, and much more of a head-on type of affair. But from what we've seen so far in test fires of the weapon and reports from what we've seen, it might become a fan favorite. So we'll see. It seems counterintuitive to have something kind of well, first of all, named the Ignifist, but we'll see if that'll grow on the troops.
Yeah, we'll have to see. When you were thinking of an arcing anti-tank weapon, that is the Warden answer for the Ignifist. And it's deployed a little bit differently. That's used on a tripod. They do have a shoulder-mounted version, but the tripod version is much more stable and has longer range, is what I heard from a report a couple days ago.
Yeah, positioning there is going to be key, particularly on elevated ranges, as well as how those shells might potentially arc over the terrain, and it'll be a beautiful ambush weapon if someone can really plan ahead with it. I hope those using it will be smart enough. I would hope people who are going to be using it are going to be smart enough to use elevation to their advantage, but if they can't, they can certainly try and fire over obstacles as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and this does seem to be one of the unique weapons in the Warden arsenal in that way. I guess it's a unique option for both sides, like they're answers for each other. This one specifically, though, with its arc, elevation is going to be key. Ambushing is going to be key because you can fire that weapon over terrain, over walls. Ambushing is going to be a big thing. It does seem like a harder weapon to use for that reason, partially because you're open to so many options in using it. I guess the question is how well it can be utilized and how much the Warden infantry army steps up to that plate specifically. They can use and abuse it. That'll be a major advantage for them in this conflict.
Advantages for them as well. Even for the Colonials, they have deployment of new fragmentation grenades called the Bomba Stone. I'm actually getting more partial to these names as I say them out loud. Colonial Bomba Stone grenade. new coat of paint on the outside and a little bit of a different boom. But in terms of how they'll play out, do we know of any tangible difference, of any differences in how they perform?
Yeah, actually, I as I mentioned 2 days ago, I heard some reports from the front, and I was sitting down with some of the soldiers as they walked me through. We didn't actually get to try a lot of the things out. The Bomb Stone was one I had not been able to try out, but he did walk me through it. It's not as much. It is a fragmentation grenade, however, it doesn't specialize in the explosive aspect, which is the fragmentation grenade that we know from the past. The Bomb Stone has a little bit of a wider area of effect, but that's because it focuses in the shrapnel as opposed to the explosive aspect. It is really good at sending shrapnel flying a far distance. Doesn't exactly do as much direct. It doesn't affect structures either because it's all just fly into dirt and wood and such. But the shrapnel does it does lots of superficial damage to soldiers, generally causing bleeding of the sort, or suppression of trenches, things like that. They were talking about different ways that they were going to use it. So not as explosive, more about the shrapnel. That's the tangible difference that I heard.
And you know what? Before we even move on from there, we can't be forgetting the DACUS ISG.3. And is that correct? This thing packs a punch.
The name I heard, I didn't hear the number. And yes, that's one of the rallying cries almost that I've heard behind the Colonial Army. They are hoping to put a lot of weight in this new 30 millimeter round. They came up with I don't want to say came up with a new caliber, but they opened up new factories to make a whole new caliber for this weapon specifically, and a lot of the Colonial Army is thinking, yes, this is going to fill a gap that we have needed filled for a while, and that is an anti-tank and anti-structure gap that they've needed.
Mm-hmm. And just seeing how this thing has performed, or at least getting reports from how that thing has performed against the lightest of vehicles, it is going to be it's going to be a quick jab and a bit of a haymaker behind it too, depending on how fast you can where you can hit it and how fast and you can fire the thing. But just really overall, just seeing all of these new heavy weapons, these kind of two-person weapons, these crude weapons. Crude as in CREW, need two people to help set it up. It is going to be interesting. It may feel like a gimmick, but certainly out on the front where people may not be so organized, the very tip of the spear, things in the wildlands, things might be chaotic, and I have a feeling you're going to see a lot of dropped tripods all by themselves, or a lot of dropped heavy weapons without tripods dropped on the ground. But I would hope that with the increased organization that we've seen, then we can start to really see more of their use. That is depending, however, if people will be able to traverse the snow and rain and mud and the cold that we've noticed throughout the border territories here. If you want to move on to that.
Absolutely, and the logistical aspect of all these new weapons is going to be compounded by these severe storms that we've been seeing. As I mentioned before, war oftentimes really is chaotic, and that's not a new analogy for anybody, especially if you're watching this program. But adding the elements of the weather themselves, like when that starts fighting you and hindering you, it throws a lot of things off balance. What we saw earlier this week was an actual blizzard, a rather large blizzard that engulfed all of the Deadlands and even stretched as far south as Umbra Wildwood. The blizzard itself was fairly severe. Temperatures going well below zero. Soldiers trying to continue to fight, at least to hold their territory, and found themselves needing to retreat and give up ground in order to get to some form of heat or fire where they'd gather around for long periods of time. Because it was so cold, soldiers would be freezing out in the field. And I don't mean that in a, like, I'm cold, I should put on a new layer or something like that. I mean actually frozen soldiers were found along the abandoned ward area. Did you hear about this? Have you heard how severe that storm was?
I had heard reports and I had heard, various stories about it. Frankly, it's surprising that it's taken this long for people to realize that you can't wander around in the snowy fields of the north or the muddy lakes and shorebeds of the south if and not get hurt by Mother Nature. So I think now people will start to really get the lesson now that these storms have picked up. So yes, I heard the stories, and I think we're going to hear a lot more of them, and I think a lot of renewed focus on hunkering down, building up bases, and really getting to know one of another in the trenches. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, whether to people's consternation or to people's excitement as social creatures. We'll have to wait and see. But just the fact that General Winter and Colonel Mudd might have to say a few things about delaying an attack, for instance, we're gonna have to see how the troops respond to that. So I don't know. What's your take on that specifically?
My take is your take on that. I think we're going to see a lot more defensive play in that time, and it's. I've heard mixed feelings from the soldiers on the front. Obviously, nobody likes a blizzard, but what I've heard is people who are trying to take charge of a situation that is trying to take charge of them, for lack of a better word. In this case, what soldiers have noticed is their immediate reaction is to fall back to their trench lines, fall back to bonfires that they have made just to keep warm. And for some of them, their first thought was, well, wait a sec, the other faction is doing the same thing. So if we think we can, let's dive behind enemy lines, extremely risky, and try to take out those bonfires, try to suppress those trenches to keep them out, essentially risking their own life and limb. I mean, they're doing that already. That's what they signed up for as soldiers. Though this specific little extra risk to try to catch them even further off guard. It seems like an extremely risky idea. I'm saying risky. It's not for me to decide what war strategy should and shouldn't be. But that is definitely a high risk, high reward kind of situation, I think.
I think so too, particularly when you consider just how much you have to carry out there. But I do think that people are gonna adjust, because it's literally adapt or die out there, and it's always been like that in warfare. But as I said before, when Mother Nature gets involved, you really sit down and listen. Now, we have set up a system within the PressCorps in an attempt to try and keep the public informed about the weather. The first thing I should say is that we know just about as much as you do in terms of how we can forecast the weather. In fact, it's hardly any forecasting. It's a much more reactive way of delivering news about the weather. So maybe you can look to us for some form of confirmation. But you'll probably see us running around on bicycles trying to map out the edges of a storm. We'll see if we can develop any kind of technology to improve upon that system. But for now, that's how we're going to go about it. And our system will be a watch advisory warning level system. So for light snow, heavy snow, and excessive amount of snow where things can get awfully deadly, awfully quick, it will go in that direction. So watch, winter weather watch, for instance. Soldiers and vehicles will not be at risk of freezing. Rivers and oceans will not be frozen. Shelter and campfires will not be necessary. However, there is snow falling, of which we can confirm, henceforth the watch level. And then by the time you get to level 3, or rather the winter weather warning, warning will be our most severe. Soldiers and vehicles will be at serious risk of freezing rapidly. Rivers and oceans will be frozen. Shelter and campfires will be strongly recommended, but whether or not you listen to that recommendation is your own fault, and the event will have peaked. Same thing we can also mirror in terms of rainstorms. Light rain, severe storm watch. If it continues on and gets a little heavier, severe storm advisory. And by the time we get to the harshest of storms with thunder and lightning, you'll be seeing severe storm warnings. How exactly, how accurate will be, we'll try and maintain a high amount of accuracy. How quickly we can get this news out to you, that might be a whole different story altogether. We're still kind of building up our infrastructure internally within the press corps, but certainly that'll be one of our goals throughout this 71st conflict. So Everett, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that system, and how you think it'll play out? I know we talked about it earlier, so I'm kind of repeating dialogue, but I'm curious to see it. Certainly to hear what the audience would also like to hear from us.
Of course. No, I mean we've spoken about it internally, but this is our first public announcement, if you will. Yeah, we'll be watching the weather and reporting that, sharing that to all of our listeners as accurately as we can. And the key there is as accurately as we can. This is a new feature for us as well. It's very low tech how we are reporting it, and we already have plans in the works to make it, if not predictable, then at least we'll keep as up to date as possible. All of our reporters have been briefed on all of this information, and we're all pretty ready and understand, and like, okay, we're hearing snowfall. It's time to get out in the field and if not track it directly for ourselves, then at least ask amongst the radio waves, if you will, to hear reports from the front lines. How far are we seeing snow? How far are we seeing rain? And what areas it has affected. When we do go live in the future and letting you, the audience, know where we have a advisory or a watch or a warning, we will let you know how severe it is. We'll let you know what precautions to take, just as Geoffrey said earlier. And we'll try to let you know as soon as we find out and get all that information organized as well. One thing that we don't quite know yet, since we've only seen one of these storms, is we understand it can be very severe. Obviously, it could be less severe. One of the unknown factors for us is how widespread these storms can be. The last one we saw was engulfing more than the area of Deadlands, the region of Deadlands. Mm-hmm. They might be bigger in the future, and that's one thing a lot of us are kind of worried about. They might be smaller, maybe they're more localized to only one region, or smaller than a region. We don't know if we're going to see major storms go across the entire War Valley, if you will, or if they're just going to stick to smaller areas. It is a very large unknown for us. We know it's a very large unknown point for the soldiers on the front line. We'll keep you up to date as best we can as we hear more information about that. But yeah, we do have a predictive system in the way, kind of building up as best we can. Geoffrey, any expectation when that could go live, for lack of a better word, Mr. Studio Man?
When it'll go live in terms of our weather system?
Yes, that's the question.
It less of a concerted system, and I'm sorry, not a system. It will be a system, but less of a concerted meter, as if you are tracking, say, a rocket, and more of we'll try whenever we get live breaks on the air. We'll try and include weather whenever we can as part of our daily rotation of news. Does that make sense? As opposed to, say, the PressCorps Rocket Watch, where we have a concerted meter on what level the status of the ballistic rocket superweapons are at. We'll be more focused on just getting more reports out there whenever we can, and hopefully updating the weather as we go. It may not be a completely comprehensive system, but that is actually something that we are working on, is trying to be more round the clock and comprehensive. We'll see where that goes.
Excellent. I want to pivot away from weather, as vital and important a topic as that is for the 71st conflict.
I think weather might very much, particularly wind, might factor into this next topic, so yes.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the new pieces of equipment that will be affected by the weather, just as you were saying, was a new level of artillery that both factions have put out. And this is something that I'm actually getting as we're speaking now. I'm getting a bit of a new update. Artillery in the past has been relegated, if you will, as an almost ranged demolition tool of sorts. The purpose of artillery going forward is being expanded, however. What I'm hearing from the front for both Wardens and Colonials is that they're hoping to bring artillery much earlier into the war than it used to be. That used to be, we would wait we would wait a very long time until both sides were entrenched in their positions before we would see artillery, and it seems both factions have said, why wait for the enemy to be entrenched before we start bombarding them with artillery? Let's bring it out earlier in our tech upgrades, if you will. And it seems both factions have done that. The report is that new artillery, new light artillery specifically, may even come as soon as the first, hard to say, the first week or two of the war. And on top of that, this light artillery, as it implies, there is a heavy artillery, but this light artillery has further range than the old howitzers did. I mentioned earlier how there was more range, but also how the individual rounds are going to be more devastating. This really can't be understated. The new light artillery for both Wardens and Colonials are looking to be some pretty powerful features of the army. Have you heard any specifics? I could fill in what we haven't heard yet, but have you heard anything?
Just in terms of how farther that they fire and how much more buckshot and spread out they appear to be. That's pretty much the extent of what I've heard. But that alone is going to be a huge difference in terms of how these artillery pieces, these fire support weapons will really affect the front line and beyond the front line. Certainly some ways away, up to 300 meters, 350 meters, I think. Of how far they fire. So it's no longer just a storm cannon able to fire so far beyond, but more common among the line, if you will.
Yeah, more common is going to be one of the key aspects of this, but also with that, in the past, when soldiers have heard there is artillery in this particular field of play, they have an understanding of what artillery would mean. Maybe in this case it is an indirect fire group of mortarmen that is specifically trying to target key defensive structures. Artillery now, after this point, is looking to change roles to more of a wide bombardment, as you were saying, wider area of effect. And on top of that, as you mentioned earlier, it's affected by the local weather patterns in the area. The ranges are going to be...
I think every artillery battery, every howitzer battery is going to be is going to have a watchtower nearby just for that little flag alone, because I think you were about to say this, that the wind might even carry the shells farther than their actual ranges. Absolutely,
and that's a point that we don't quite know yet. You did mention that the ranges are out, at least what the engineers have said, is they're out to 300 meters, 350 meters. And that's before we account for the weather. That's before you account for defilade and other, like, if you're firing from on top of a high ground, how much further your shots can go. So, again, this kind of boils down to quite a chaotic war, and in this case, the chaos comes from not exactly outside factors, but a level of just unknown capabilities of these new weapons. It's going to be pretty impactful. Okay, pun maybe a little bit intended, but it's going to be quite impactful, these new artillery pieces, as both sides are looking about the map and trying to figure out where is the best place to set up an artillery battery, where is the best place to land an artillery bombardment, if you will. Both sides are going to be using this new weapon they're going to be experimenting. That's what I'm trying to go for. They're going to be experimenting, trying to figure out what's the best way that we can use this.
Right, more of a bombardment and suppression ability than less of a direct demolition kind of affair. And I think that alone will drastically... the nature of fire support has been drastically changed. Curious to see how that will affect mortars. We talk a lot about artillery and howitzers. I'm curious to see how that will affect mortars as well. We'll find out in a few couple of days, I'm sure. But with that being the case for fire support now, how will demolition be done now that artillery isn't primarily a demolition tool? I think that's going to equate to a lot more close quarters engagements with the various infantry tools such as satchels and sticky grenades and whatnot, and eventually when vehicles hit the field, when heavy armor hits the field, those as well. But I would hope that for those who are trying to preserve their lives or use more combined arms, at least for them, they would want to use combined with this fire support ability, now that they're going to be more common, likely to be common, and can fire farther.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good distinction here, that demolition tools of the past were artillery because you can destroy enemy structures and defenses at a nice defensive range. And that's not going to be the case anymore. If you're looking to destroy an emplaced enemy, or at least their structures, you have to get in a pretty uncomfortable range, at least until there are new vehicles that are unlocked, teched, produced, engineered, etc. Until those start hitting the field, it's going to be your common soldier holding a high explosive stick grenade of sorts, throwing it in the danger zone, quite possibly while under fire. This again leads to just a more chaotic, a more bloody war. So both sides are predicting that the demolition aspect of warfare will be more direct as opposed to indirect fire. This is kind of going into like military terminology here. It's going to be more direct fire. The Colonials are going to be leaning much more on the 30 millimeter infantry support gun that we mentioned earlier. They've noted that that is a pretty good demolition tool. The Wardens have their own tricks up their sleeve. They have always relied on their vehicles, and one of the vehicles that kind of match the infantry support gun has been their heavy armored car, using that as an assault vehicle to push front lines. Whether they use that again this war is up to the Wardens and their engineers, but that has been their go-to in the past, and it's been pretty reliable from all accounts. So we'll see if that makes it in this war.
Absolutely. If you're just joining us, Everett Way, PressCorps Everett Way is anchoring this opening war coverage and pre-war coverage. A war that we have yet to declare has actually begun, but all signs point to such, as both the Empire, the Sievish Empire, and the Malayan Colonial Republic is on that verge once again. The 71st conflict here in the Foxhole Wars. And that war, well, we know that they tend to start at the tops of the hour. We may very well be at the top of the, or we will be at the top of the hour very much soon. We'll see if the war will start on time, so they say. I know that
it's interesting how they schedule the ceasefire to end at a specific time. I guess it's almost the only order that could be brought around to these kind of things. But yes, both sides have called their ceasefire off. A new conflict is to begin in this ongoing war, and the battle lines, if you will, the tentative territories that both sides are holding, has been drawn straight across the River Mersey, with a few exceptions. So those who are veterans of this war, if you will, have seen this territory set up from previous conflicts. In this case, there is a lot of ground to cover. I think this is just about the entire War Valley. All regions are being... there's no out of bounds, if you will, for this particular conflict. All regions are being fought in, or at least will be fought in. As far as that starting territory, however, like I said, it is east to west across that river that splits the entire region in half. That's the Mersey River there. There are, however, a few exceptions, as I've said. In the Marben Hollow region, Colonials have a foothold amongst the Spit Rocks. I believe that's what it's called. Double checking yes, the Spit Rocks. And there's an equal foothold on the opposite side, close to equal. We're not exactly sure as far as the territories are concerned, but there is a matching foothold on the south side of the river for the Wardens at the Tomb of the First. This is in the Lochmore region. There's also similar exchanges of territory, if you will, along the outskirts. In the Tempest Island Godcrofts area, both sides have ceded a territory to the other, with the Colonials basing out of the south from their colonies, if you will. They have a foothold in Godcrofts, and the Wardens have a foothold in Tempest Island. There is also a similar match in Orebreaker Isle, if you will, with an exchange of Partisan Island for... And help me with the name here. I should know this. My map, however, is cutting out. There is a region in Orebreaker Isle, Cofteri, that's it.
Yes.
The Cofteri region in Orebreaker Isle is owned by the Colonials at the start. It's fairly straightforward as far as veterans of this war have been concerned. However, those outliers are key, and I haven't talked to many of the war generals, if you will, but I'm sure that's what they're talking about. Is a lot of their opening plays for this conflict will revolve around those regions that are out of tune, if you will, that are unique for each faction. What do you think? Have you heard from any of the frontline commanders if they're planning on operating in any specific area, any regiments going loud, if you will, for the first couple days? What have you heard?
I really wish I could, but the ones that I actually have a gag order in terms of what I actually know. Actually, everything I do know, they're like, hey, please don't spill this over the air. It's not a lot, but it's unfortunately I really can't go much on beyond that. But I will mention that there are groups that there's the usual regiments that you'll see out on the front line, such as 82 GK for the Wardens, Swords of Mar for the Colonials, but you'll potentially see a lot more, or at least you'll see more groups coming out of hibernation, which Everett, you mentioned earlier, but I want to reiterate that it's one of the reasons why we're putting kind of a magnifying glass to this war, just because a lot of people are coming back to it. And how that's going to play out, how people are going to get back on their legs, get their feet wet again, whether it's going to be like picking up riding a bike, although honestly that's harder than people say that phrase is, but whether or not it actually is like riding a bike again, or if people will get a little bit of a shock to their system, I don't quite know. But returning groups and new groups surely as well as these new regimental systems are put in place. We'll just have to wait and see.
Indeed, and one of the big factors for the new incoming groups is I'm gonna launch off of your riding a bike metaphor here, and it's kind of
Right.
like with the new groups coming in, they're like, okay, here's your bike, and while it may be normal for the people who are coming in, for those dormant people, they're like, what are these extra gears in here? There's like a third handle, and this a new thing. There's so many changes since a lot of these regiments come in. It's hardly recognizable. What new weapons, what new equipment, what new mechanics of warfare have been developed between now and when those regiments used to play in the past. Of course, it's going to be different since when they last fought. Some of them have been dormant for a very long time, only coming online now. Specifically for example, the new artillery changes. I know a lot of regiments are coming back to saying like old artillery groups are coming back online to use those and give those a bit of a more specialized eye. I've heard more groups coming in just because we don't exactly know how much logistics will be needed with all of these new weapons and things, or even to combat the storms, what new strategies we'll need to come up with. So new minds in the logistics area are coming in. There's going to be a lot of new players in the field, if you will. Yeah, certainly shaping up to be a very eventful, very populated war here. I haven't heard too much about the war strategy specifically, and this is for a lack of information as opposed to you who have heard but have a bit of a gag order, and that's completely understood. Nobody exactly... no faction will want to put their battle strategies out on the air for free for their enemy to listen to.
And if they did, I wouldn't trust it. If a group came out to me and said, "Hey, here's exactly what we're doing," I'd report it, but I wouldn't trust it if I were the audience.
Mm-hmm. And information warfare, if you will, has been a thing. It won't exactly be a thing for the PressCorps. We'll, of course, keep it as neutral as we can possibly be. This is not an avenue for that. But yeah, I'd agree with the sentiment entirely. Personally, I believe the focus for the first couple days of the war, if you will, are going to be those territories that are across the river, for whatever faction can hold that territory on the far side of the River Mersey. Mm-hmm. That's going to be vital for future offenses and a good launching point. They are, however, incredibly exposed as they are right now. And you can, if you look at the areas in Marvin Hollow and Lockmore, they just kind of open up for all areas of future offenses. But that also means that there are many ways that the defending faction for those areas can move in to attack and kind of quell that area of activity, if you will. Where do you think the hotspot is going to be in the first opening hours, minutes, days of the war?
I think it's going to be the usual, particularly if this is going to be a kind of a big war where the entire Siva Valley border territories have completely opened up. So certainly around the Deadlands, certainly around Endless Shore and the approach to Saltbrook, the city of Salt, and the River Mersey outside of Jade Cove, up and down that line. And of course you can't forget about the flanks at Lockmore and John Vale for the Colonials. Marvin Hollow will actually be an interesting fight. Just because the Wardens purportedly have control of Loggerhead down in Drown Vale, but to the north of the Wardens, the Colonials will have control of the Spit Rocks and Lockheed. Lockheed, that's not much of a surprise since that peninsula connects to Endless and Drowned. But the fact that they got so far as to Spit Rocks here in the skirmishing phase is it's going to be interesting to see if the Colonials would try and pincer around, perhaps cut off East Deadlands, or possibly even just go down south and really secure their back flank. I'm not quite sure. And then, of course, the Lynn of Mercy, the peninsula at the Prairie Bazaar, that it looks like there's a big green bulge going into the north, and there is, but the fact that it's a peninsula connected to the colonial side of the river, that's hardly a surprise. So you'll see it at the big cities, and I think Marben Hollow and North John Vale will be a point of flanking contention. That's my guess.
I tend to agree. That's when we have a map drawn out here, and we've charted out where those territories are, and that is a large sore spot for both sides. Having Warden territory in the Drowned Vale, having colonial territory in Marben Hollow, that is an eye catcher, if you will. When you think about it at first, you're like, okay, it's a small thing. No, it is a large amount of territory in those regions. It'll be interesting to see how both sides react to that. I do think that that's going to be a focus. And then after that, we'll see the major players, the usual places. We'll see Abandoned Ward being fought over. We'll see Endless Shore and Saltbrook being fought over. That's going to be a major logistics hub along the eastern fronts. Of course, we're going to see Jade Cove on the other side. We'll see that being fought over. Important for both sides that is. But yeah, I think the Marben Hollow Drowned Vale front is going to be one of the places to watch. And going forward, we already have reporters trying to get out into that area, working with the soldiers to get rides in their logistics vehicles up to the front line. They're trying to deploy as far forward as they can to try to bring you the stories as this war opens. On that note, it is very close to the time that the ceasefire is to end. So if you are watching, if you are listening, thank you very much for listening. We have reporters going out to the front lines, as I said, at this moment. We're going to take a small break here as we reconnect with those reporters and get their words and the soldiers that they are staying with and their words live to you here on air. There's going to be a short break between now and then. We're looking about 20 to 30 minutes as we get all the lines patched through. But we will be back with some live reporting from the front lines. The 71st conflict of the Valley Masayan War is due to start any minute if it hasn't started already, and we just haven't heard directly one way or another. Listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back very shortly. We're going to cut to a little bit of music, I believe. And when we come back, we'll have some interviews from the front line. We'll have more reporters coming in. So please stick around. We will be back, as I said, in about 20 to 30 minutes with more news from the front. This has been Everett Way and Geoffrey Jennings with the PressCorps. We'll be back